Hi guys, it's Nancy and I have another video for you on the Wonderful Tulips Glimmer plate. This was the video I had done before and I had a couple of questions. So one of the questions was, does it come with the die? And it does. So in the kit you get the Wonderful Tulips Glimmering plate, you get the die which cuts the outline. Well, I guess it would cut like that, okay? And then you get the sentiment and you get the die that cuts the sentiment. So yes, this all comes together, okay? The second question I got was, how about watercoloring it? It looks great with the layering stencils, which are optional, but I know some people aren't into stencils, okay? So let's see what it would be like to watercolor. Now, my concern here is generally watercolor paper does not like to foil. So we have to find a watercolor paper that is super smooth. So as you can see, I have my glimmer plate on my glimmer and I've cut down some gold hot foil. This is glimmer foil. So we're going to put some of that down. And the watercolor paper I'm going to use is a watercolor paper I discovered last summer, and it is from Northwoods Rubber Stamps. This is watercolor paper, and it's very thin watercolor paper, and it does have a textured and a smooth side. So we're going to put the smooth side down. Okay. And we're going to cover that, and we're going to do the 60-second countdown. And then I'm just going to bring in some watercolor markers. So I have some of my Zig markers here. You can use any water reactive markers and a watercolor brush, water brush. And we're going to see if we can foil this and watercolor it. So that's a 60-second timer that's counting down. So all this is doing is just warming up the plate and everything. So I'm going to pause the video and I will come back when that timer is done. And then we will run it through my platinum machine. So I'll be back in about 30 seconds for me, but 2 seconds for you guys. Okay, our timer is done. We are disengaging it from the glimmer system. We're going to slowly run this through the Spellbinders Platinum. And I believe I have enough pressure. I don't think I need to add any extra shims. I'm only going to run it through once. And let's see how this watercolor paper foils and if we can watercolor on it. You can also use traditional watercolors or paints, brushos, color bursts, any of those kinds of water reactive pigments should work. Okay, I'm going to set my glimmer aside. And you always want to let this cool before you reveal it. Okay, that actually did pretty well. I am impressed so far. I mean, you can definitely see there's some texture like here in the center areas. You can tell that it's on watercolor paper, but for the most part, that looks pretty good. Okay, and of course we can save that and use that later. Let's see how we do here with our Zig markers and our water brush. I'm going to grab a piece of paper towel, which my children stole from me. Hold on. Okay, got some paper towel. And this watercolor brush is not putting any water out. Sometimes these things happen, so we're not going to fight it. We're just going to grab some water and a good old-fashioned paintbrush. All right, now I'm going to start with the wet on wet method here. So I'm just going to put some water in the area. It's kind of neat because the foil resists that. Where I want the color. I'm going to just take some of my marker then And you can do it either way. You can do it that way, or you can color first and then move it. But I want more of that blooming effect, so if you do the water first and then do the marker, you'll get more of that blooming where the color travels through the water. But either way will work. Okay, once I have the areas I want yellow, then I'm going to go in with some orange. I'm going to start with the bottom. You can see how nice this watercolor paper reacts with those pigments and just draws that out. So easy. It's a little lighter when you do the color after it's wet, but we can let that dry and go back in and add it and layer it in there. So you can see as it's drying that we're able to put more of that color down. You can use Tombow markers, Corrine markers, as long as it's a water-based marker. You don't want to use any alcohol-based markers. This one, I can probably do the yellow and the red at the same, or the orange at the same time. And I start from the bottom where the darkest color is and I pull it up to where I want the lighter color. If it gets too dark, you just re-wet your brush, pick up that color. You can lift it with the brush and you can actually pull that color off. So if it gets too dark, you can always add more water, and you can see here how it lifts that color out of the way onto my brush. And my brush is not very wet, it's just damp, you guys. I'm not adding a lot of water to this. Very little water is needed to move these pigments, colors. Now I have too much on the outside here where it's kind of spread. So same thing, I'm going to wet my brush, go along the edge, and you can actually take a paper towel and kind of push that and lift that color out of the way. So if you make a mistake, it's very easy to lift some of that color out of the way with watercolors. So I'm going to let that one dry and we'll come back to it. And remember, you can let it dry in between and always come back and reactivate that color with your watercolor or your water brush, and then move it around again. You can lighten it, you can add more color and darken it. And watercoloring is very forgiving because a lot of people don't expect watercolor to be so precise looking. It's very freeing. And like I said, if you got any of the pigment powders, like the color bursts we just used, this would be really pretty with those. And this does not hurt the brushes at all, the markers, by putting the color down first. And there you can see the blooming or the wicking when it's wet, that the ink wants to kind of travel along that water. And the more it dries, the less of that you get, but the more intense the color is. So you can see as this is drying, more of that orange is intensified. And as we add the water, it dilutes that a little bit. This also works with watercolor pencils. So you probably already have something in your stash, but I think if you want to foil and watercolor, you definitely need watercolor paper, but you want to find a very smooth watercolor paper. Not necessarily a thin watercolor paper, a smooth watercolor paper, because the foil does not like porous surfaces, so it'll give you kind of the bumpy, grainy look. So you want a very smooth watercolor paper. So try what you have. If it's thick, you might have to run it through 2 heat cycles to get the foil to stick, but it has to be super smooth. I'll see, I don't like some of these hard edges I'm seeing, so I let that dry a little bit. Going back in with my brush, just slightly damp, and just kind of reactivating that watercolor. And this time I'm pulling that color down, the orange down, so it's not so harsh looking, and it's lightening up the tips of my flower here so they're more yellow, and that orange is staying at the bottom. Same thing on this one, just kind of almost like a blurring effect where I don't want that harsh line between orange and yellow. So just add some more water and drag that down, and you can see how it kind of blends that in better. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to go in and add some more orange and yellow to this once it dries a little bit. But so far you can see how pretty that looks. And again, I went outside the lines just here a little bit. So I'm going to saturate that with water, and you can see it doesn't erase it completely, but it saturates it and it moves it and it dilutes that color out. All right, let's do some greens. I have 2 colors of green. I'm going to go direct in with the green, and then we'll pull that color out. Now see here, that was wet and my green touched it and it started to spread, so we just want to be careful of that. Not doing anything super special with my coloring, just adding the layer. And now I'm just going to take some of these lines and I'm going to follow that with the darker green. And again, the water will spread that green out, so it will do a lot of my shading for me automatically. And these are super fine tips on these zig markers, so it makes it very easy to get into those little areas. Okay, that's all I'm going to do there. And again, I'm just barely dipping the brush in the water, taking it out, and taking the majority of that water off on a paper towel. And then I'm just going to take the brush and just add that water, and you can see how it dilutes that marker, brings that color down. Whatever direction you want it to go in, it will go. So you can watercolor on foiled elements, and it's nice because the foil really does resist a lot of that ink. So you're not hurting the shine of that foil. It's very pretty. It's just a matter of finding the right paper to be able to do that. And since most watercolor papers are thick or they're very porous, doesn't work out too well. So you want to find a very smooth watercolor paper that's not too thick, that the heat can get through the machine and give you the chance for that foil to stick. And watercolors, dye-based inks, markers, they tend to dry back because what the dye does is it's dye-based. So it goes in and it dyes your paper. So as it does that, it tends to dry back. So your colors aren't super vibrant. So if you want to make sure they are, you can always layer them. Remember, they're a translucent color. So you can always layer them and bring that color back up. So I brought my yellow back, but I want to bring some of that orange back. So again, I'm going to go direct to the paper here and intensify that orange a little bit. I like to work in small sections because I don't want this ink to saturate into the paper too much and then dry, and then it's really hard to kind of pull it back up and get it to blend. So I like to do one, you notice that I kind of did one flower at a time instead of going in and coloring them all yellow and then coloring them all orange. I like to do one section at a time so that I have that working time to make sure I can get these blends and so they look seamless. You don't want any harsh lines when you're doing watercoloring, because if you just put that color down and you walk away from it, it's really hard once it starts to dry to get that to move again. So we want to make sure as we're putting the color down, just do small sections at a time. Bring that color out, move it along, blend it, and then let it dry a little bit. And then if you have to come back and work it a little more, it's a little easier then because the harsh lines are gone. There we go. And then anything that, again, you don't like, you can put a little bit of water on there. Okay, obviously didn't stay too well in the lines here. And then just take a paper towel and dab at it, and it'll lift the mistakes for you. Probably should have used a smaller brush, but this is okay. This is a number 4 silver black velvet brush. You can find it on Amazon. I'll link it for you guys. Okay. So there you go. So to answer the question, can you watercolor over foil? You can. Again, the paper that I recommend, I'll link it down for you, is Northwoods Rubber Stamps watercolor paper. If you catch any of the stamp shows, they're usually there. This was 25 sheets, and at the time it was $16.99, and they're large. They're larger than 8.5 by 11 sheets. And then any kind of watercolor markers you have. These were the Zig. If you have the Careen, if you have the Tombow, any of those kinds of watercolor markers, and then either a brush or a water brush will work fine. And then just let it air dry, or if you want, you can even take a heat tool to it. So hopefully that helps you guys out. If you're interested in this set, I did do another video. Yes, I used the layering stencils on the other video. And here you can see how it looked with the stencils, depending on how close or apart your colors were. You can also just color them with regular markers as well. Again, I do recommend dye-based markers over alcohol markers. Sometimes alcohol markers can lift some of that foiling, but check that out. If you have any questions, post them down below. If you're interested in these products, this is a brand new release for February 2023 at Spellbinders. All the links will be down below. Thanks for watching, guys, and keep on foiling. Bye-bye.